Okay, hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be trying to do the impossible. What I'm going to be trying to do is I'm going to be trying to go over the Nimzo Indian in less than 15 minutes. That's right, less than 15 minutes. I'm going to be showing you the entire Nimzo Indian. So please buckle up, pay attention, because we're going to go over a lot of stuff really quickly. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. This starts the famed Nimzo Indian. Now the reason this is going to be a very difficult video to do in 15 minutes or less is because there are 8 main lines here. Count them, 8 main lines that we're going to have to go over. There is g3, knight f3, pawn e3, bishop g5, bishop d2, queen c2, queen b3, and a3. Now, the goal of the Nimzo Indian, it's a neoclassical opening. So that basically means that the idea is depending on what white does with his center, we are going to either move our pawns 1 square, 2 squares, we're going to put our pawns on dark squares or light squares, depending on which bishop that we have. And that way, we are going to end up with all of the upsides and none of the downsides of the other openings in all the right worlds. So we're going to have control of the center, we're not going to have less space, and we're not going to have any bad pieces, or at least we're going to have the options to do that based on what white does. It doesn't always work out perfectly, but it works out better than it does in a lot of the other openings. So let's just take a look and see what each of these options has in store for us. So let's start with variation number 1, e3. So, e3, this starts the Rubinstein variation. In the Rubinstein variation, the move that I like to play is simply the move c5. Now, after the move c5, I have 2 aims. Aim number 1 is I'm trying to actually create like an isolated queen pawn position after the move c takes d4, e takes d4, d5. Aim number 2 is I'm actually trying to get to the Hubner variation if they play the move knight f3, which we will cover under variation 2, knight f3. So variation number 1 is after c5, knight on g to e2, we end up with an isolated queen pawn. We actually hold our dark squared bishop in this case. We isolate the queen pawn with d captures c4. Bishop captures c4, we castle. We bring our knight to c6. Notice that we're just playing this like a typical isolated queen pawn. The move knight d5, this was actually played in the game Rapport versus Ivanchuk in Greece 2011, and that game actually continued with bishop d3, and then after knight takes e3, f takes e3, I think black has actually a pretty favorable pawn structure here, which he was able to exploit in that game after he finished his development and prepared the move e5, which he actually didn't play for a couple moves later. But when he finally did get around to playing e5, everything seemed to work out for him just fine. He managed to simplify this into an endgame where his d-pawn was a powerhouse, and he was actually able to eventually work that into a win. Black won this game in Rapport versus Ivanchuk in 2011. So now we've gone over the move 1, e3. That's variation number 1. We are going to go over variation number 2, which is the move knight f3. So after the move knight f3, we have c5, e3, knight c6, bishop d3, d6, castles, and now this leads into what we call the famed Hubner variation. The game that we're actually following right here is a super famous game. This is Boris Spassky versus Robert Fischer, Reykjavik 1972. This was the World Championship match. Bishop takes c3, b3, castles, e4, e5, blockading on the dark squares, d5, knight e7, knight h4, h6. Fischer actually introduces a new idea here. After f4, knight to g6, he creates bad pawns on his side of the board, but the idea is solid. The idea is to give white bad pieces, to give white a bad bishop on d3 and a bishop on e3 that actually isn't doing very much. So he's basically going to give white bad bishops. So after knight takes g6, f takes e6, f takes e5, d takes e5, bishop e3, d6, we have a4, a5, rook b1 hitting the pawn, bishop d7 hitting the pawn on a4, rook b2, rook b8 defending, and then after queen e7, bishop c2, g5, Fischer starts his kingside attack. Basically, what he does is really simple. He just trades off the rooks, he gets his knight to f4, and then he's actually able to break through on the kingside pretty quickly after that. After bishop d2, queen e8, bishop e1, we have knight h5, the rooks come off the board. And then we have the knight come to f4. Once the knight came to f4, black just had a great position, phenomenal attacking. Notice these bishops never really participated in the game. After queen c2, the amazing bishop takes a4 ended the game. And Fischer won this game in the World Championship match in 1972 against Boris Spassky, because if the queen were to capture the bishop, we would have queen e4, hitting the bishop on e1 and hitting the pawn on g2. Okay, so that's variation number 2, knight f3. So we don't have time to waste because we got to go on to variation number 3, queen to c2. This is more of a modern main line, and this can actually lead into more of what I would like to call hedgehog formations, or stuff that's very similar to hedgehog formations. So after the move c5, d takes c5, castles, we have a3, bishop c5, knight f3, b6, bishop g5, bishop g7. I want you to note that after the move e3, both of the bishops in black's camp have their mobility, because again, we've been flexible in the way that we've moved our pawns, and we haven't moved our pawns in such a way so that we actually block our pieces, making sure that we have no bad pieces. This is a theme that you see throughout the Nimzo Indian defense in many of of the variations in many of the lines. This game actually proceeds into something a lot closer to a hedgehog. The bishop retreats to e7, rook d1, and we have d6. This is what we call a hedgehog formation, where the pawns kind of sit here on the 6th rank. In this case, this isn't a horrible hedgehog because there is no pawn on e4, so we don't have a Marcosi bind. Bishop e2, a6, castles. We have queen c7. And black does actually manage to get all of his pieces to good squares, and all of his pieces are developed. And that's pretty much all you can ask for out of the opening. Black manages to simplify the position, and in so doing, white accepts a bad pawn structure, which he probably shouldn't have done. And actually, this game ended up falling apart for white shortly after the move king g2, when the person playing the black pieces by the name of Vasily Ivanchuk, a pretty famous player, managed to play g5, g4, broke through against the king, and then brought his rooks to the king side. At this point, the game is probably over. And he finishes it off with the move rook g3, hitting the king again, and then bringing the knight into e4. White decided to resign here in Shipov versus Ivanchuk, Las Vegas, 1999, because now the threat of obviously this rook moving with mate is very, very bad. So white had to give up the ghost in this game. Okay, so that was the third option, queen to c2. Fourth option, pawn f3. So after pawn f3, we have to switch gears. We have to play d5. f3 is trying to play e4, but Nimzo Indian is actually a classical opening. In classical openings, we don't want our opponent to control e4. Now, modern players, they actually give up on the idea of playing pawn to e4 with white. What modern players do is modern players go for this all-out kingside attack, while black is trying to get counterplay on the queen side. We're also going to see this in another variation as well. We're going to see this in the Samisch variation. Although there is an alternative here that's very playable for black. It's a little bit safer, but a little bit more passive. Okay, so now in this case, black plays d5, and after a3, we have safer alternatives. We can make moves like bishop e7, e4, d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, d5, bishop c5, made sure that we had no bad pieces, and after bishop g5 castles, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop f3, queen f3, knight on b to d7. We played bishop d4, knight e2, and then c5. And then there was this game between Nakamura and Carlsen, Zurich 2014, where Carlsen proceeded to attack the queen side, and Nakamura proceeded to attack the king side, and Carlsen was actually able to break through on the queen side before Nakamura was able to break through on the king side. So bishop e7 is an alternative to bishop takes c3. So after bishop takes c3, though, we have b takes c3, c5, cx d5, ex d5. I'd like to point out another safer alternative here. Another safer alternative is knight takes d5, d takes c5, queen a5, and then after knight a6, the only problem black really has left to solve is getting out this light squared bishop. I like knight a6 the best. It seems like the move that doesn't get in the way of anything. And black was actually able to solve that problem in another game where he held the knight on e5. He managed to play bishop a4. And again, this was another Magnus Carlsen game where Carlsen was playing the white pieces this time, and Mirosevic managed to free his position with bishop a4 and managed to achieve a draw in Moscow in 2009. So our main stem game in the f3 variation, though, is actually a very famous game. It's actually the World Championship game. It went b takes c3, b takes c3, c5, dc5, and then e takes d5, and then Anand, who was playing the white pieces in this game, decides to go out for an all-out kingside attack. So now knight c6, g4, he starts attacking the king side like crazy, and the only thing Carlsen can do is attack the queen side like crazy. But, as we'll see in other variations as well, this does allow for black to have just enough counterplay that he manages to survive. And he gets the counterplay, in this case, in the form of his b-pawn, which is threatening to make a queen. And then after rook f4, we had making the queen, and then this is where Anand goofed. He could have been okay if he played the move bishop f1, but instead he made the blunder knight f1, which is very disappointing. And then after queen e1, since the queen can now sacrifice itself for the rook that's going to go for h4, Anand had no choice but to resign. Okay. Option number, I think we're on 4, bishop to g5. I think this is option number 4. Let me see here. We've already gone over g3, knight f3, e3. So this is option, we've already gone over queen c2. This is option number 5, bishop g5. We have h6. This is actually, I've heard this referred to as a couple different names. We don't have time for names right now. So h6, bishop h4, c5, d5, bishop c3, b c3. Once we take on c3 and they play b takes c3, what we're going to do is we're going to play d6, e5. We're going to put our pawns on dark squares. And again, we're going to try to hem in those bishops, and we're going to try to make those bishops bad pieces. And we're going to try to make those pieces just not play very good in the position. So after d6, we have e3, e5. Notice we've put our pawns on dark squares. We have a light square bishop. We have no bad pieces, but white has some bad pawns. As long as we can keep white's bishops bad and we can keep black's pieces good, we're in good shape. So here, actually, black gets very aggressive. He pushes back the bishop and he pushes back the other bishop. He's actually trying to control both bishops in this game. h4, rook g8. He's just trying to control everything. And he was able to achieve this in this particular game. And he was able to actually trade off and eventually play the move f4, which left white in this particular game. Williams versus Karpov in Nice, 1974. No choice but to resign. And at first it might appear a little strange that he resigned. He's just got a couple bad pieces. But if you look at the options here that he has with those bad pieces, if you were to play e takes f4, we have g takes f4, and then e3 with queen e3 is going to be a winning attack after king c2, knight e5, hitting on g2 and hitting on c4. Or he could have played bishop h2 right away, in which case, again, the move knight e5 coming into c4, grabbing that weakling, and then after rook g4, we have the pawn hanging on d5 again with a decisive attack. Okay, so that is option number 4, bishop to g5. So now we have option, that was option number 5, bishop g5. So now we have option number 6. We have queen to b3. We have queen b3. c5. This is actually very similar to a lot of the queen c2 lines, but it's a little bit different. After takes, we have knight c6, threatening knight d4 to c2. That forces kind of the move knight f3. And then we have the move knight e4, which again forces the move bishop d2. We simply snap up our bishop pair. We take on c5. And then after castles f5, we're going to castle and we're going to play the move b6. And this, again, is going to leave black with no bad pieces. All of his pieces are going to get squares. And we're just going to have a very favorable position out of the opening. And actually, there was a game, it was Pekleza versus Wojciech, Warsaw, Poland, 2007, that proceeded with a3, bishop b7. Wojciech proceeded to whip up a kingside attack. He managed to simplify, and then he managed to go into an endgame where he had activity with his 2 rooks versus this weak white king. And he was able to work this into a winning attack. And white was forced to resign. Okay, option number 7. We've gone over queen b3, so we're going to go over option number 7. We're going to go over the move bishop to d2. Now, bishop d2 isn't a very well-respected option. And let me bring it up here. So the move bishop to d2, one of the problems with it is this bishop typically ends up being bad. So you actually won't see a lot of strong players play the move bishop to d2. After the move castles, knight f3, b6, e3, you have bishop b7, bishop d3, d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, castles, bishop d6. You'll notice that in this position, white still has a bad bishop on d2, and he continues to have this bad bishop on d2 throughout the course of this game. Black is forced to block off this bishop and to prevent this queen and bishop from coordinating on the light squares. But after black blocks this off, he basically just leaves white with this bad piece. In this particular game, black wasn't being very ambitious. He just wanted a draw, and he was able to achieve it very easily. And this was following the game Nakamura versus Guri, St. Louis, USA, 2019. Okay, so finally, the last variation. It was said by one great player, if there is a refutation of the Nimzo Indian, it would be in this move. And this move is the move A3. And this is called the Samisch variation. So the game that we're going to follow again is a very, very famous game. This was played in the Candidates Tournament, Zurich, 1953, between Max Erway and Efim Geller. Geller had the white pieces, Max Erway had black. That game proceeded bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and then c5, freezing those pawns in the middle of the board and freezing the weakling on c4. And this game again follows that theme that we saw in that World Championship game, where white gets a lot of play on the king side, but black gets a lot of counterplay on the queen side. So then after e3, black proceeds to blockade the middle of the board. Here he has to be very careful. He actually has to retreat this knight prophylaxically to avoid this pin with bishop to g5. After knight e8, knight g3, c takes d4, c takes d4, rook c8. Black is attacking that weakling, and white gives it up voluntarily so that he can attack the king side. The king side attack proceeds, but after rook h4, queen b6, black creates this pin. And he's going to post his knight on the e5 square, which gives him enough counterplay to save the game after getting rid of white's most dangerous attacking piece. This position looks scary, but black was able to play a super awesome move here. he was able to play the move rook h8, deflecting that queen from the c2 square and getting counterplay on that queen side with rook c2. We see it time and time again. Even though white gets this huge attack on the king side, we are getting counterplay and we are actually breaking through on the queen side and we're okay. So then after queen takes h8, he was able to play rook c2, rook c1. He captured. And then after queen f3, he had to resign. And this was Geller versus Max Erway, Zurich, 1953. Very famous game, and you can look that up in the book. And there is also some analysis on this game that Kasparov did that is actually very good. Okay, I managed to show you the entirety of the Nimzo Indian in 15 minutes. If you didn't catch it all, you can rewind the video, and you can look at the different variations that I gave in a little bit more detail. And you can actually look up those game citations on your own if you want to find more detail. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something new about chess.